Okay, so we are moving now to the last part of the plenary session of today's proceedings. And the idea is this. We talked about the future and how great it looks, but now we're focusing on the real question, which is who owns it. For that, we'll have a panel discussion that's going to be led by Professor Keutzer, who's going to give you much more details about that. I have to say that Professor Keutzer has to be credited for the growth of this event because he has been leading it for the last few years prior to Dave Patterson. He's also a consultant to Cadence Design, serves on the technical advisory boards of Zero in Design Automation, Catalytic Inc., QWERTY Shape, Stretch Inc., and Tensilica. Kurt is a fellow of the IEEE, and he had a long, illustrious industrial career before his long, illustrious academic career. So, Kurt, all yours.
Okay, so as kind of a timely effort, I'd like to begin by starting with an answer. We're all going to play Jeopardy. Okay, so here's the answer. This conference has keynote speakers from, who are CEOs from AT&T, Cisco, Google, Intel, Microsoft, Qualcomm, SoftBank, Twitter, and Yahoo. Now that's not videoed in. Those people showed up and delivered their speeches. Do I have a question? Yes. What is the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona? That's it. So I thought I tried many different ways to introduce this panel, and I thought that was a particularly appropriate way because let's think about, many of the academics in the audience know how hard it is to get any one of those CEOs to show up for a conference, much less all of them together. So why did they all show up in Barcelona? Barcelona has great parties. That's certainly part of it. But in that, AT&T was there because they were talking about the future of wireless communication. Cisco was there because obviously it has a huge impact on wired networking. Google and Yahoo CEOs were there because the conference has a lot to do with, or a lot of impact on the internet. Intel was there because the mobile, I think many people see as the future of computing and semiconductors for computing. But then Qualcomm was also there because it has a lot of impact on the future of communication semiconductors. SoftBank was there for finance, Twitter for social networking. The only company whose CEO I think should have been there, and they must have been disappointed, is either the CEO of Electronic Arts or Blizzard, because clearly Mobile World Congress has a lot to do with the future of gaming. So the question we're trying to address here today is who really owns the future of this future mobile client, which has so much influence against all the other industries in high technology? So it's a big question, and to answer it, I think we've assembled a really great panel. I'm going to start from the far end. So at the far end is one of UC Berkeley's own professors, EECS, Eric Brewer. Eric is the founder and chief scientist of Inktomi Corporation, now part of Yahoo, and he's also been very involved in wireless technologies for the third world, the second world, and the first world. Next is Alan Messer from Samsung. He's the senior director of the Convergent Technologies and Standards there in their Silicon Valley R&D Center. Then we have Greg Heinzinger, who is senior vice president of Qualcomm's technology licensing division. He's investigating new licensing opportunities, technology implications, and acquisitions. And I want to go through those first because, Eric, of course, is obviously very involved in Berkeley. Samsung has been a strong sponsor, and Qualcomm. And we have a new visitor, a company we don't see so often, Humphrey Chen from Verizon, where he's executive director at Verizon Wireless, focused on new technologies in the new market development area. And he's head of Verizon's new 4G Venture Forum. And Humphrey actually came back from this Mobile World Congress just for this event, so he tore himself away from all those parties in Barcelona. So thank you, Humphrey. And I went in reverse order. As you heard, Samsung's been a strong sponsor. Qualcomm just did this new lab, and Humphrey, I wanted to let you know Verizon is welcome to contribute at any time. As a matter of fact, I thought maybe if you want to kick off by say giving me a cell phone or a small token, that would really be fine. Yeah, I used to work for a living, and I would shrink when faculty did things like this, but now I'm one of those people. So I realize as we talk about who owns this future of the mobile client, there's an implicit question there, which is, what is the predominant client platform that we're talking about? Are we talking about a handset? Are we talking about some media internet device? Are we talking about a tablet? So I'd like to pose that as the first question to the panelists. And I know as market shares and pie charts, that's all going to be very complicated. So let me simplify the question. Which of these devices do you anticipate you'll be carrying in 5 years? So, like Humphrey, what are you going to be carrying in 5 years?
5 years. Well, I think what's kind of been interesting is to answer at a top level, the platforms that are the most open end up being the ones that are most easily adaptable to the latest trends. And so from that perspective, I think we've already all seen so much, on the one hand, you see people have been talking about it negatively from a fragmentation perspective, but then because it's allowed so many people to kind of innovate on different dimensions, it's kind of flourished in a very, very healthy and robust manner. And so from that perspective, in some senses, and I think you guys all know that that's Android, right? And so if we view that as kind of being one flavor of very healthy open, and then you've kind of got other pillar of Apple where you've got the ultimate closed platform, but it is more open than it was before, but that ends up being kind of the most fun mobile platform. And then you've kind of got BlackBerry as kind of being the most closed work platform, which they both have their own flavors of open, but the reality is at the end of the day, if you look at kind of BlackBerry and Apple on both sides, you've got Balsillie and Jobs who pretty much control what can and won't, what will or won't happen, right? And whereas kind of in the middle there, you've got Android that ends up being pretty open, where you don't have to ask anybody anything. Everything is published. You can do whatever you want. You can have every splinter or capability, a swarm, anything. That could be the Swarm OS because nobody has to pay any fee, right? And then if you take a look at Microsoft and now Symbian and those areas, you've got more flavors of kind of dynamism, but you've got licensing fee structures, and then we can go into that separate topic. So right now, I think it's the short answer is the one that's most open and less encumbered and least hindered. And so I think from that perspective, I think you guys all are aware of that we've made a pretty big bet on that, but it's not our only bet. So I'll just leave it at that.
So, but in terms of form factor, are we talking about a handset here or a tablet?
It's kind of one of those situations when you work for a carrier, you do end up finding yourself with way too many devices. So it's like when the Galaxy Tab came out, I was playing with that. I had the Android, I had the iPhone, I have the new. So I've kind of been trying to consolidate, but I think in some senses, like what you end up finding happen is that when you're kind of a early adopter, you end up getting excessive specialization, right? Because you want the best of everything.
One of everything.
Yeah. So from that perspective, it's kind of hard to have the best of everything all in one, right? So when I had the iPhone and when I had an Android or a BlackBerry, I tried to consolidate into the Android device, and I ended up finding myself missing different parts of it. So I still wanted them to have them all, right? But I think the reality is we're not representative of your average user, and the average user is actually content with good enough of a lot of things. They don't need to have the best of everything. So asking me about what I need to have, I'm still going to end up carrying a lot and probably having a vest. And the reason I wear jackets still is extra places to hide devices and extra batteries and all these things. But I think the average person can totally deal with good enough, consolidated in one. But then they still are also going to kind of get hit up against battery. So, and battery ends up being another reason to have more, because then you can kind of figure out when you want to use what, where, and when, and how.
So we're going to have a chance to talk about things in terms of proprietary and software stack and so forth. So now I'm just trying to get a sense of, what kind of platform are we talking about? I mean, in a handset, tablet, or something like that? I mean, what do you think?
The physical form factor still.
The physical.
And so physical, if you ask me personally, I would carry more of a handset form factor just because small, fits in my pocket. For moving around, though, I actually kind of believe I'll be going, my kids will carry bigger ones. They kind of like to watch video. They're not driving yet, so they can watch video. So I see different form factors. I actually don't see it converging to just one either, because I think we're going towards a world where instead of I wouldn't consider where we got today necessarily that we're thinking whether they're closed systems, or they're also very more OS-centric systems today. I think we're moving towards a world where we're going to see devices that do more something out of the cloud that's more web apps, and I can easily move things between devices. And what I'd really prefer is to get to the point where I've got these web app-based services. Instead of thinking of it being an application, it's a service I subscribe to. It can work on different devices that I choose at the time. So it may be that while I'm driving around, a phone is a great form factor. I get into work, it may be that I want to carry around a tablet because when I'm in a meeting, a little bit bigger UI is a convenient thing to do. I'd still like the services to move across all of those, and I think we're moving towards that type of a world.
Well, so to jump into that for a moment, so which type of portability do you think is going to be more important? Say portability of a software stack across different handsets, or portability in the vertical dimension from your handset to your tablet to your laptop up to your desktop machine?
I think it's in a vertical dimension, but within an ecosystem. So when I start going into some kind of web thing, I think we're evolving towards not worrying about the operating system, but worrying about the ecosystem that you exist within. And I don't think realistically we're going to end up with one ecosystem. Today we've got a couple, right? We've already brought up, you've got RIM's ecosystem, we've got the Android ecosystem, we've got an Apple ecosystem. Qualcomm's tried some other ecosystems, Samsung's trying some BADA, different people doing ecosystems. I think you'll end up some bit vertical, but within an ecosystem. I think in a few years we'll be down to just 3 or 4 of those ecosystems, and you work within an ecosystem of services. I think player-wise they won't completely standardize it because each of them is working towards what their position is.
So Alan, is the actual footprint of the platform even relevant to you, or do you think, as we've heard from the previous panels, maybe more about the ecosystem that they play in?
I think it's a little bit of both. Form factor is clearly very important to get the right device for the right job. Everything from tiny devices, smaller than a phone, all the way up to, today a modern laptop is a mobile device, with a wide area network card in. So, people are using different sized tablets, different sized phones, some people like small, some bigger, and we'll just have that variety depending on the usage. Even your car potentially is another mobile device. I think the trick is getting the services and the data, which is really what you care about, potentially the user experience across those devices. It doesn't really matter to me if on one platform it's running Android, another one it's just some kind of web platform, maybe a third one is some kind of feature phone, which is actually a very large slice of the market today. I want to make sure that the same thing I can do on each of them. And you'll see the most successful services these days, like the Twitters of the world and the Facebooks. You can basically do that from any platform where you don't care what the operating system is. What you care about is, can I tell my friend that I'm just eating a hamburger right now? And that's what's important to you. And you don't care what the OS is. And that's really what the user cares about. They want
same friends.
Right, and that's what they care about. So it's all about getting the same services and data and to some extent, user experience. It's not really about the platform.
I guess I would reiterate the last part about the cloud, which is I think the most important thing for any of these devices is still access to the cloud. That's the kinds of applications that will be the most successful and will drive usage the most, not to mention just plain old communications, which is still the biggest app on phones. But I'd also say that there's, the physical form factor is going to vary because we're going to be able to afford many different devices. Right? I'm, again, atypical. I have at least 3 or 4 now of different form sizes. But really, I want access to the cloud, and I want a form factor that's appropriate for what I'm doing, which is, do I need a keyboard or not? Do I need a large screen or not? And those kind of, in my mind, the 2 most important variables. We've seen already ways to dock your phone to make it into a laptop, ways to have HDMI out of your phone to drive a large screen. So we're decoupling these form factors a little bit anyway, and I think you'll see more of that. But I think you will see physical form factors because the form factor is actually task specific.
One thing that's been interesting is just a middleware kind of glue across all my devices is just like Evernote, right? So I've got it on my Zoom, I've got it on my iPad, I got it in, so it's almost like, if you're in your living room sofa, you're using, the iPad. You're in a train, then you're using your phone, and it's almost like the right device and the right form factor. But it ends up being kind of like that ends up being my effective notepad, right? So that ends up kind of being the thing that bridges it across all of them.
So I was surprised nobody brought up I/O in the consideration of form factor. So do you see I/O? Everybody talks about. I'm not so great at.
Size. What other I/O do you want?
User I/O as opposed to data I/O.
Yeah, sorry. So in terms of, one thing that kind of determines my form factor is how big my hands are and how much trouble I have typing on an iPhone screen. So am I an anachronism, or do you think form factor will continue to kind of limit how small we can really get in our basic computing device?
I think that depends. If you take a broader look of I/O and consider user interfaces, is a big area we see coming forward is what could be done, and I think Avide talked about this some with the AR work, but really with two different things that we're not using today. Right now we're limited to a touch screen or some buttons. But if you start seeing where we're going with the processing power, I think we can get to the point where vision starts to become much more powerful local computation, not for maybe what a lot of us have thought about, but just to allow us to do gestures. So I don't have to necessarily have a keyboard. Or it could pick up gesturing about things. You know, you could wave in front of the screen and do things, gesture type thing, which will require a lot of vision processing locally to let us start moving into new. I think that's one of the new ways the UIs are going to evolve is into gesture. And the second input that we don't use richly today, but we've started doing some research that shows you can do some really interesting things, is not just the vision, but the audio picking up. If I'm in a room like this, most likely my phone should be able to contextually aware, notice I'm in a meeting, there's a certain amount of background noise, you hear prominent speakers, it probably means I'm in some type of presentation, I would like my devices to adapt. So I think between the vision and the audio, we can do a whole lot more to make devices behave just inherently contextually aware of what we would like them to do that we haven't seen yet. And I think we're just getting to the point where the silicon's strong enough to say, do the local processing required for vision if you're going to have it detect a lot of things and really do motion, or let me do a quick keyboard thing that requires processing that's only right now becoming available. Same thing with the audio portion.
And with speech. Speech recognition certainly fits that category.
I think the real difference, though, is how you use these devices. So you're seeing right now a big change where a lot of people are using the devices, particularly tablets, as consumption devices. So you sit there like my tablet lives on my coffee table at home most of the time because it's great for watching TV and doing other things like that on. And I don't need to type very much. A couple of search queries, you know, it's 10 letters most, it's pretty easy. Whereas other devices like a phone, you're interacting with it very heavily, you're communicating through it. So it depends, I/O depends on the usage. And I think in communication devices, even things like voice are can be very effective. In other devices, actually consumption devices, gestures can be very useful because you're not expressing that much information. You just need to tell it, oh, next movie, please. And so a gesture is great for doing that. So it depends on the usage. And we're seeing a change from just devices that are multiple tools, stroke communication devices, to a variety of usages, consumption, medical, communication, a variety of usages.
So Humphrey, let me ask a particular question. So I expect you see a lot of the consumer face. So it sounds like, you know, the human-computer interface is not, you know, some sort of barrier to adoption of future mobile devices. That's
yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to see some, you know, companies come to us with kind of new, you know, the whole touch interface is kind of opening up a desire for people to kind of break away from the QWERTY keyboard, because the QWERTY keyboard has been around for so long, and while we're all familiar with it, there are certain, you know, limitations to that. And so from this perspective, the touch aspect, you know, I just came across a company, you know, 4 buttons, and so they've kind of architected it so that basically, based on the shape of the letter, you end up hitting a certain button. And so from that perspective, there's more ability to kind of trial this stuff. In the past, they would have had to have gone through to us and say, are you willing to kind of ship a new device with this, you know, revolutionary keyboard? And we'd be like, you know, that's way too risky because we might be stuck with a lot of inventory. But the reality is, if it's now an app that you can install on your keyboard and actually a lot of people start to like, then suddenly it gets legitimized. So I think there's really kind of new ability now to kind of explore new frontiers, whereas before we were all kind of limited to the 9-button keyboard, and then now we all have the QWERTY keyboard, but then now people are trying to figure out, well, if I'm trying to type and the keyboard is now blocking the person I'm trying to see, then I can't actually type anymore, right? So there's new problems that are emerging, but there's newfound flexibility around how to solve it. So I think from that perspective, there's some kind of built-in flexibility here to help solve for that right now.
Mm-hmm. So there's
about 80 to 90% of the world can't use a QWERTY keyboard. Right? It's not the small part. We're the minority that actually touch type.
Mm-hmm. So one more background question before we kind of dig in more of the market, which is, in the back of our heads, are we thinking of kind of a cloud-centric universe in which, as Alan was kind of alluding, the tablet or the handset is really a pretty passive device serving information that's out there in the cloud? Or are we seeing the handset and the tablet being a real active computing device in which we're doing a lot on it, and then maybe there's an equality between the client and the cloud? What do you think, Greg?
Well, I think we've hinted at some of this before. So I see it going towards a world where a lot of things are cloud-centric with the computation. There's a fair amount of computation happening locally, but to facilitate your applications. And I really want things to cut across platforms, which really pushes you back to the cloud. The cloud-centric also lets me do things. It's much quicker for people to keep things updated cross-platform. Applications change now, and with HTML5, we're seeing the ability to have a web app that actually has some local presence, but the next time I connect, it can update it. So I'm not worried about, am I updating my app? It's happening naturally. And I'd actually say part of this fits in with where you say where you really want to go is we've talked about traditional kind of things you could do with the phone, but I actually view that people really want to move towards a place where I've got most of my stuff in the cloud. My apps, there's services, call them web apps or whatever, there's things I want to do, I sign up for, but I really want to take what I consider control of what's going on, which I want to have my living room follow me around, I want my bookshelf to follow me, I want my music collection, that's all in the cloud, and I'd like to be able to control it onto the most convenient, best device nearby. So when I go to Eric's house, I'd like to take out my control device, be it this or another one that I have access to, and suddenly on the stereo, I want to play my music collection, and I just push it up, and I've got all the digital rights, and boom, it starts playing on his connected stereo, and it's bringing my things with me, but not necessarily just embodied in the device, but embodied in the cloud with some amount of local computation to facilitate that.
So I'm going to be a little bit contrary. Obviously, the cloud's important, yeah, Twitter services, that's fantastic. You should see the power of these things. I mean, if you look at actually what's happening in a lot of the ecosystems on Android and Apple, gaming is the big thing, right? I mean, if you look at what Apple has done with the iPod Touch, they sell it now as a gaming device, more or less. That's their pitch. And you can't do that in the cloud so easily. It's about running on here. It's about dual-core processors, you know, OpenGL graphics acceleration. You know, you've got 32 gigabytes of flash plus numerous megabytes of memory. You can do a lot with these devices. And obviously, we'll use the cloud to go across devices. I totally agree. But I think we're seeing a shift that's not so obvious to some of us that just use them as communication devices, that people are using them as much more, and particularly the younger generation. And I don't think we should discount that. I think there's a wave of extra functionality, be it image recognition, voice recognition, gaming, computation-intensive tasks that you can now do without killing a battery.
I would agree with that. I think there's particularly for video and for input processing like speech and video processing on the input side, it's tremendous power that's not really been unleashed yet. You see it a little bit. I mean, there's now quad-core CPUs for phones. Also have, I think, ordered 10 GPUs on the same chip, right? And that stuff is never going to be never as long, but you really don't want to do the video processing by sending the video over the network into the cloud, right? It's bad for latency, and it's expensive, and it's bad for power, right? Those aren't going to change the relative equation for that. And it's practically free to add this additional computation onto the phone. I mean, relative speech. Phones are increasing faster than Moore's Law at the moment for a variety of reasons. Better integration, more focus, ability to drop the power consumption at the same time you're improving the processing power. So it's an extremely innovative sector, maybe the most innovative sector, really. It's just remarkable.
I'm sorry to do this to a fellow professor, but you spoke just last year about the primary use of the handset is to access the cloud, right? So
I still believe that, but your access to the cloud will be better if you have local video processing and local speech processing.
I see. All right.
I mean, let's maybe compare. You could access the cloud through a VT terminal, right? But it's much better on my latest, Pentium, my core PC. It's the same. You can
Even the best games are going to be cloud-based state with local video processing.
Okay.
Well, and maybe the way to kind of bridge that is kind of this idea of rich, seamless persistence, right? So before you might have had seamless persistence through a VT100 terminal on a mainframe, but it wasn't a rich experience, right? So now you can have really high 3D vivid interactions, and if you finish the game on one device, continue it on another one somewhere else on another planet, another side of the planet, and you just continue off where you were, right? And so from that perspective, it's synced in with the cloud, because nowadays very few people are offline, right? I mean, offline is more the exception, and whereas before it was the norm and you had to dial up in the modem and connect. Now when you're offline, it's actually because you want to be offline, and the things I find, at least from my devices, when stuff's offline and you end up losing them or whatever, and then everything kind of gets melted and all the data goes away, and whatever I had only on that device, I end up permanently losing, right? But if I actually had it already all somewhere else, it ends up being kind of immaterial that I just switch to something else, right? So that allows for that seamlessness, which people want, which we also want too, because when there's, nobody likes sync cables and trying to, those concepts are almost to some extent, on the verge of extinction, because they just aren't really needed anymore.
Well, great, thank you. I'd like to transition into some of the business-related issues, and in particular, kind of maybe the natural progression is in terms of the hardware, and if we say look at the laptop and the PC, it's interesting that the people making the dollars in the hardware in those platforms are Intel. It's in the semiconductor portion. Whereas, if we look at the handset and tablets, I think it's still up for grabs, right? So maybe, Greg, starting with you. So where's the money in this picture? Is it in the Motorola's, the integrators? Is it in the semiconductor companies which produce the communication, semiconductors which produce the computation, integrating those two? Where are the dollars in this picture? And who's going to get them?
Who was that to?
Sorry, that was to you, Greg. Yeah, that was a softball to you.
Who's going to get them? So obviously, since we're making the silicon, I mean, we think there's a good play within the silicon to continue to take, a reasonable chunk of the value chain. It's not as clear as it is, say, with PCs that the OEMs won't continue to take a reasonable amount of the value chain. Is that so far device form factor and local configuration stuff have proven, I would say, versus the PCs, to be a much more important point in where we see people actually making more significant money. If I would look in the phone industry, the OEMs, at least some of them, Samsung still makes quite a bit. Apple makes an extraordinary amount on their platforms. The OEMs actually are still making money, whereas in the PC industry, we've seen it really end up being the silicon and the software providers and the people making hardware virtually making no margin.
Mm-hmm. And did you want to name names about companies that you think might lead in the future of this?
Lead in the future of
the mobile product. So you talked about the OEMs are still going to make a lot. So in particular, we're here to name names today. So who do you see as the leading handset supplier, leading tablet supplier, 5-10 years out?
I can answer that for you if you like. Not to piss off.
I might proffer to suggest that it's Samsung, but I'm maybe a little bit biased, just a little bit. I think there's two sides to this question. One side is obviously the raw hardware question, and people through the whole ecosystem have to make money. And if they don't, then there's going to be a problem in the market. And I think one thing that we do well is we try and make everything in the ecosystem. We try and make the processors and the memory and the screen and the whatever. And that enables us in a lot of the markets to be able to compete because, you obviously see a lot of great OEMs and ODMs in places like China, et cetera, who are really getting quite advanced in their ability to make mobile devices. So the ability to make a mobile device with all the various bill of materials that's necessary and squeeze things tight enough that you can still make some money on top. It's very important. But the flip side, and I think this is where Greg mentioned this briefly, is what Apple does, which is the value. Right? The cost of the hardware is clearly very important. And the more you own, the more you can squeeze is very important. But the other element is how much can you sell it for? And that's not the same thing as how much does it cost. And one of the things that Apple, and I would argue Samsung, and some of the leading manufacturers do, I think, well, is adding the premium element, where you can sell hardware that has some value add, intrinsic value add, or integration, or whole picture value add that gives you extra value that service providers and consumers are willing to pay for. And that's a little bit intangible, but that's what Apple does very well.
But we're seeing a era of very rapid evolution in these platforms. Don't you think that's going to settle down and all this is going to be commoditized?
Hopefully not. I mean, I would say hopefully not, for the reason being that when I just went back to the PC analogy, I think if you end up with an ecosystem where there's key players who don't make enough money, I would claim that's one reason I think PCs have kind of petered out, is there's not much innovation in them, because the people making the hardware make almost no money on it. Therefore, you have to make good margins if you're going to invest in R&D. So our preference would be we'd like to make, we were doing a horizontal play within the silicon, but would like to see the manufacturers make reasonable things to keep the new device form factors and new innovation going.
So what's a feature that's going to make me buy a new handset in 2015? Anybody got an idea?
Speech.
That we haven't mentioned before. I mean, I think by 5 years out, you will have a level of AR. I think it's going to be more the overlay of information on your world than thinking total immersion AR. It's giving you information, which does require an awful lot of video processing in the handset, because, you know, they were showing us tags and stuff, but you got to realize is when they're on here, you're moving this thing constantly. So if they're not moving in real time with it, pretty soon, you know, you got the Starbucks menu in front of Subway, and you know, it doesn't work. So I think you'll see that. You will see the vision coming, and probably some of the speech and stuff coming.
I want to go back to vertical integration for a little bit, because I think, to be fair, both Samsung and Qualcomm, I think, actually will do well, because they're doing a fair amount of integration across a wide swath of the space. And the phone space, unlike the PC space, the vertical integration is much more valuable. I think that will last longer because of the tightness of the form factor and the tightness of the energy limits. Both give you a bigger advantage for having a vertically integrated solution. So even like in the Apple iPad, one of the famous chips in it is made by Samsung. That's, I would say, fair to say, just because Samsung could integrate a bunch of things onto one chip, reduce the power and reduce the costs for Apple. Right? And so if you can take from a wide range of things, at least for a while, that's going to be a pretty big advantage in this space. Eventually, will it settle out to having, you know, more clear interfaces and boundaries, something like a PCI bus or something? Yes, I think that'll happen, but it's further out because of the value of integration is higher in this space. And that's all the players that can do that are going to have an advantage, Apple included.
One thing I'll just add on the OEM front, I mean, what we're kind of seeing, even just as individual end users, that each company, you know, these companies are kind of just like people. They all have different personalities and different, you know, strengths and weaknesses. And so, you know, Samsung, you know, their screens are just fantastic, right? So they're very vivid, and so from that perspective, people are like, oh, if I'm going to watch lots of movies, you know, the Fascinate, you know, ends up being like the perfect phone, and you know, clearly HTC ends up leveraging those components, so that kind of they're able to leverage that competency. If you like, you know, well-engineered kind of solid things that are more rugged and, you know, optimized for voice, then like Motorola has been kind of exhibiting that pretty well, as well as like solid battery life. And then, you know, and then I think if you kind of are optimized around entertainment, then at this point, you know, the iPhone ends up being kind of the ultimate, because you've got all your music in iTunes. So these individual personalities are kind of like revealing themselves through each of the OEMs, and so depending on which personality you align with, you end up kind of like naturally falling up in line with that. So it's kind of hard to say who's going to most naturally like, you know, own it, because, you know, there's so much variety in the population. And
so Humphrey, the other panelists are projecting a pretty rosy future of continued innovation, a lot of different variation, new features, entirely new approaches to input gesture recognition, speech, and so forth. Do you think that's all going to be commoditized, or do you fall there? Do you think it's going to be?
No, I mean, I think what makes this, you know, industry overall just very interesting is that we're all, you know, everyone wants to keep learning, everyone wants to keep innovating, everyone wants to keep improving, and the whole network at this point has become the ultimate market playground, right? So the app stores now are you know, the bar in the past to kind of get an app into a phone before was like, you know, you had to know someone special, and to get it in there, it would take like a year to get there. Now you can get an app into the store in weeks. You don't need to know anybody, and make money off of the stuff and see whether it sticks. And so every app store has become like a beta zone, right? And that level of experimentation just says, hey, let's just all throw stuff out there and see if it sticks. And if it sticks, then wow, there's an opportunity to like turn it into something really big. And because you've got the market feeding into this, you know, it's going to keep changing. And the only reason it wouldn't is if everyone stopped thinking about new things. And that'll be a sad day if that ever happens.
Well, apps is a good transition over to the software side of the fence. So in terms of applications, I mean, do we see a Microsoft or an Adobe of the future, or is it going to be App Store, or is Samsung going to offer, or and Apple going to continue to offer a lot of their own apps on their own devices, or what do you think?
Was that to me?
That was those to you, sir.
You know, I think there's probably going to be some eventual consolidation around this. You know, I think one of the areas where everything can start off small, but then at some point, you know, places like in the enterprise category, they're going to kind of want things off of trusted brands and trusted companies. And so from that perspective, where they have dedicated sales forces and historical track records, it's easier to kind of rely on a bigger play. So in certain, you know, so in the enterprise category, I see some consolidation needing to happen from amongst the many small players.
If I could point you right there. So when you start talking about enterprise and reliability, I hear research in motion. Does that sound right to you? Do you think, well, can you see them having a large role in the business side of the wireless world, or?
Yeah, no, they're already in every major enterprise. So I think the thing with RIM on this front is how they're able to kind of deal with this newfound onslaught of competition from every dimension and every angle, right? So so if you take a look at the playbook, they've got, you know, it looks like it could be a great platform. And then, you know, initially it makes sense from a strategy perspective that they would want to tether it back to the BES, because that's part of their kind of, you know, strength is that, you know, IT control, right? So from a strategy perspective, you could say, hey, that makes complete sense. But then, you know, from an end user, if you suddenly just deactivated your BlackBerry, is this now enough? Is the playbook suddenly enough to kind of turn on your BlackBerry again because of that, right? So in some senses, the strategy could actually hobble the execution of that. And I'm just saying my personal thoughts here. I don't want to represent the company, but but you know, but things like that mean that when you have to think about what your base already has, it's not as easy to kind of keep extending and moving around. So I think clearly they've you know, BlackBerry has strength in that area and best-in-class security and control in the mobile phone. But then when you try to reconcile that with the trend around bring your own phone into the enterprise, where someone buys it on their own dime, if someone buys a device that, while it could have the potential to be a great fun phone, but IT has precluded it or prevented it from being a fun phone, then why would you want to spend that on your own dime if IT has all the rules in place to prevent you from having fun? So then you're going to have a device that is less hindered, less encumbered. And so that kind of force that's happening right now is probably what is really at the crux of the challenge right now, where they want to strike that line of having the right control, maintaining the security, but then also kind of being in line with what end consumers are wanting, which tend to be the exact opposite of security and maximum control.
And are you seeing a lot of lockouts by IT departments of different wireless devices?
Well, you know, what sense?
So
Platform-wise?
You'd alluded to, like, I'm at a Fortune 500 company, security is important, and so forth,
no,
like that.
so
I
I'll give you one
go off
example.
and buy a new phone, but they come in and go, no, you can't get our corporate email on that.
Well, no, so I think I'm seeing the reverse, where IT is kind of essentially kind of having to open up their doors because their senior executives are saying, you know, you need to accept this as a standard because that's the phone I'm going to use. And IT normally would have just said, no, 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 no. Now they have no choice. And so from that perspective, they might say, okay, but we need to get this done. And so the bar for security might have been here and then temporarily drops here, but then it starts moving up quickly to kind of get back to where it was before. So we're finding newfound flexibility around that. But, you know, I'm going to give you an example on the previous one, where one of the banks I was working with, they were experimenting, taking pictures of checks on their BlackBerry and being able to do deposits on it. And so they were chartered with that within the bank. And then while they were doing the trials, their own IT department turned off the feature to use the camera, right? So it's like one of those situations where the people who were actually trying to like break the frontier on that ground got hindered by their own department. But so anyway, we're seeing a lot of change in there because people are trying to change the business model so that this stuff can be more flexible. And the whole bring your own category, bring your own PC, bring your own mobile phone, is kind of really changing or necessitating changes in how companies view, expense, and manage and control this. And for the most part, before it was a very limited number of handsets that were distributed out. Now they have to deal with the diversity of them and yet try to do them in a consistent way.
So future of the software portion of the platform, what do the rest of you think? Are we going to see consumers winner in a business?
About HTML5, I think it's kind of here now but coming, but in some sense, if you're not Apple or Android, you probably want web apps to succeed because now any new thing that comes as a web app, it works on your platform too, or at least you should be able to make it so that's true. So one way to catch up is to shift the game to be a game about web apps where the kind of the app stores matter less. And I would assume that's going to be part of the new Nokia strategy. It's certainly something that RIM ought to do. In fact, it's the same strategy that Apple uses for their Mac against Windows, which is to say Macs are relatively more successful than they used to be because the cloud matters more and the apps on the laptop matter less, right? So that's increased Apple's market share on the PC side, right? But since they have the main app store, they'd actually like it to not go that way for phones, and I think that won't stand the test of time. The HTML5 apps are quite good. They include direct support for video and audio and also direct support for disconnected operation, which is new for HTML and very important. It's something that you could only do in an app before and you couldn't really do in a web app. And you know, it's not solid yet, frankly, and I think it's going to take another year. I mean, we can see what other people think, but it's certainly, in my mind, the most interesting thing to watch in the software space because it's a leveling force for platforms.
I agree with that 100%. The interesting thing to note is that even a platform like Android now, which is by some metrics overtaken Apple, it's only a couple of years old, 2-3 years max. Even though they may seem very dominant today, and we obviously make a lot of devices with Android on, it's not a done deal. And I think the nice thing about HTML5, is there's way more developers of HTML out there than there are iPhone apps or Android apps or whatever. And HTML5 has some great features. The other nice thing about HTML is it can run on devices that are not traditional app platform devices. So a device that you might perceive as being proprietary inside a feature phone, a TV, or whatever, HTML works just fine there. So you can actually deliver the same service even to devices that are proprietary in some fashion.
So, Greg?
I'm trying to think of something contrary, but I actually completely agree on this, that the way we're going is towards something, I would call them licensed services, web apps. I think
HTML6.
No, I think HTML5 does allow you the local and stuff, so that's the way we see this playing out, is that's a very nice platform. You know, WebOS actually puts a fair amount of that in play right now. Apple tried to do some of that early on, actually, tried to accommodate some web apps and just wasn't successful at it. So I think tool-wise it's going that way.
So, and you're all comfortable with a level playing field, that is to say, is that right?
Behind your goal is to level the playing field, and I'm saying that your tool will be HTML5, right? And there's, I mean, just pick on Apple for a minute. They're making choices that are going to accelerate this process, right? If you say no flash, that's going to accelerate this process. If you say the Sony e-reader has to sell books through your store and can't sell books via the cloud, that's going to accelerate this process. If you aggravate your publishers and they have an HTML5 option with other platforms, they're going to move, right?
So what does that do to the business climate then? So do we see kind of an app store of HTML5 apps, or do we see Adobe's rising up to be independent software providers for wireless or mobile applications, or?
I think it's a bit of both. Actually, if you look at a lot of devices today, they have a Flash and HTML, and you can pretty much deliver an application in either format. So you'll probably see web app stores and Flash app stores as well as traditional app stores. But I think the real question is differentiation. You know, to some extent, whether it be Flash or HTML or whatever, it is just that. It's a platform that you then leverage. It comes down to, you know, what other applications you bundle in, how well they're integrated, what extra features do you have. Many people don't realize that HTML5 is not an obvious thing like this bottle. You know, it'd be like the air in this room. There's not a very clear edge to where HTML5 finishes and other stuff starts. Obviously, the Wattwig and W3C have put a line around some element of stuff that's HTML5.
Which they've changed a couple times.
Yeah, and the date of when it's going to be due changes too. But there's actually a whole bunch of other stuff that's happening in W3C and other places like that. WAC is a good place for handsets, wholesale applications on HTML5, where they're providing a lot of value add on top and leveraging the HTML5 platform, but doing the differentiation. And I think it's that differentiation that's the key.
In the mobile platform wars at this point, things are, battles are being won and lost by the sizes of the developer ecosystems, right? And so from this perspective, it's not like, and they each have their own unique weapon, which is kind of giving them an advantage, right? So when you have this kind of scenario where it's level and equal across everyone, who's going to be championing that, right? And so the other battles are going to continue to grow and differentiate and add, and HTML5 will become an ingredient of what people do. But I don't know that it's one of those things where it's like, hey, everyone's got the same weapon and no advantage. It's hard to kind of rally around that one because you know that you've got no extra advantage over anyone else.
Well, so I want to make sure I got my education here. So I'm kind of surprised a little bit because I expected to hear about hardware commoditization and software differentiation, but it sounds like what we're talking about is leveling the playing field in software, and there'll be a lot of differentiation in hardware. Is that too simplistic, or Greg? What?
Well, to some extent, we're only talking about the tool set there. So when we're all technologists, and we sit here and think, people want to go to an HTML5 store, or, iOS store, or this or that, and I would claim consumers don't want any of that. I think they're going to go towards ecosystems that offer the overall set of services they want, and there could be different people who differentiate within an ecosystem going after the customer mind share that could use the same tool, but what do they offer overall? Because it's not just the tool. I think it's to assume that the tool is really going to do it. I think there may be some common tools or people may have some differences, but I really think what they're going after is more putting together an overall experience, and some of what Apple's capitalized on is they've done that fairly well. I mean, and a lot of things Apple's gone and done, they weren't the first to do it, and and they're not, a lot of their music players and stuff, they're just using standards, right? I mean, there's not like they've got this weapon that somehow they've got a technology that nobody else is doing. They're just putting together an overall experience, and I just don't believe consumers want to say, I'm going to the HTML5 store. I could see who has a bigger presence right now. I think people think they're going to Apple. Or they're maybe going to Amazon. Facebook is one we're looking at. Does that become a much bigger player in the mobile space? Because people spend so much time on Facebook that they've already kind of got them some bit captured, and it's who can monetize it. And when you say 5 years from now, there's probably some group in some little building working on something that none of us know about that's going to be one of the dominant players, because Facebook wasn't 5 years ago.
Android didn't exist 5 years ago in public form. Maybe somebody out there is working in the garage on something right now. I think actually that the car is a great example that we don't leverage so much. If you look at most cars, I mean, 4 wheels on the road, steering wheel, etc. But actually, even the engines, the fuel management system is pretty commoditized. Bosch or whatever, there's a few manufacturers who make that. But that doesn't mean we're all driving around in gray cars. We're all the same size, station wagons going around. There's the guy who makes the Corvette and the Porsche, and the guy who makes a smart car, and they're all basically the same, but they're a little bit different. And, they've bolted on navigation systems and tweaked the fuel mappings and, all sorts of bits and pieces. And I think it's the same inside phones. Sure, we'll have Androids and HTML5s, and those will be the monotronic management system of the car that makes the thing work, ultimately. But people will be bolting on these extra bits and pieces and having different style devices, because actually these days it's more about lifestyle than it is a tool. So you'll see the same kind of dynamicism that enables the Mercedes and BMWs of the world to make a lot of money, even though a lot of the hearts of the cars are not actually that different.
So who makes money in that picture?
Who makes money?
So who's actually making the money when you've got this kind of base commoditization and then you have a lot of customization?
Well, I mean, the car example is a great example. BMW, Mercedes, Porsche, General Motors apparently this year, all making money, even though a lot of the guts of that car are commoditized. I think you'll see the same. You'll see the handset manufacturers making good money and providing differentiation. The service providers, obviously, key piece of the puzzle as well, providing value-add services and packaged content, packages of devices, end screen, etc. So I think you'll see all those people make the money. The difficult part to make money probably with the low end of the spectrum, the more commodity, the closer you are to the, I'm British, so I don't know American cars that well, the Ford Fiesta or, a general mainstream car, it's harder to make money. More esoteric you get, if you're making the high-end Mercedes, you can make money.
It's interesting to hear, I guess, what Christoph's talk before. I mean, hearing trillions of connected devices, that was totally music to our ears. For us, we're just working on 500% wireless penetration, which for us in the U.S., that's a little over 1 billion users. And so we're kind of actively trying to work on getting an average of 5 connected devices per person, right? Because everyone already has a phone. We've got like 98% wireless penetration here. Then what's the second device? Is it the tablet? Is it the PC? Is it your car? Right? Is it your watch? Is it 3 or 4 things? But then the reality is you don't want to be like getting to 500% just for the sake of getting to 500%. Someone might have a heart monitor. Someone might have other things that before would have been very hard to kind of manage. But the implications there are if you have a lot more connected devices, how do we end up kind of billing it and doing it in a manner, because if we're making $100 per line per user today, we can't expect to suddenly have $500 per user per line per month. That's just, the wallet share is disproportionate. So the average per line will have to go down, right? So instead of having our PU, it ends up being ARPA, right, or average revenue per account. So the metrics around some of those things need to clearly be redefined. And in our sense, then, when we kind of plan for the future, we have to kind of look towards how do we kind of change our back end to accommodate this future of trillions of connected devices? Because today, the business models behind the scenes don't quite handle that level of complexity nor disconnectedness, right? So we want to have a situation where wherever you go, whatever devices you want, it can kind of seamlessly connect to you. But then you can't have like loosey-goosey accounting systems that are going all over the place and billing people the wrong way. So for us, I mean, we expect to be part of the value equation. I think that's also why we're here, just to kind of work with the marketplace around figuring out what's needed, where, and how. And I think the good news is, if you link that with the platform around, the analogy with cars ties in perfectly, because the devices are representative of individuals' personalities. And before it was just talking, now it's so many more things, right? So you're getting device consolidation, but then you're getting use case explosion, and that's kind of, and they're not all going to stick, but they're going to stick with the right people at the right time and on the right form factor.
Well, thank you. So before we wrap up, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the carrier network, since we have you here, and ask the other panelists. I mean, do you see any discontinuities in the network or is it just going to be more bandwidth? Is there anything that's going to change the whole ecosystem from the network side? Well, no, sorry, I was particularly wanting to, I'm sure, we'll get to your opinion last, but I wanted to get the other panelists just to have a sense of what they thought.
So, I mean, we're approaching, with some of the new technologies, we're starting to approach limits on communication, at least over a single link. So I think what we're really going to start seeing in the network that'll change things is a lot more kind of femtocells trying to spatially get diversity within the network. And then also the other challenge coming up is, how do you deal with heterogeneous networks so that it's not just a network anymore? You're trying to leverage Wi-Fi, you might be trying to leverage 3 or 4 different other air interfaces, and trying to do that well right now, nobody really has down. And so that's one big thing I see coming is, how do you cut across heterogeneous networks and actually use all the different radio channels you may have available, because we're going to need that, particularly with the data rates getting higher and higher. Because they're really, even if we say we don't use spectrum that efficiently now, and you could move people off and stuff, some of the new air interfaces are getting awful efficient, and once you move so many people off, at that point, you're going to saturate, and you're going to have to use all the networks available well.
I'd push on that a little bit and just say that the traditional model is the carrier has to backhaul all the traffic from the handset into the core of the network. And that's a physically long distance and difficult to do. And what femtocells do essentially is leverage existing wired infrastructure that happens to be located to do that backhaul. And so does Wi-Fi, to the extent you can use that. So shifting to essentially different backhauls than just the carriers is the easiest way, I think, to get significantly more benefits, significantly more places. And that'll be one part of this.
So Humphrey, I think what they're telling you is they're going to be doing more and more packets off your network using other wireless networks and wired networks. Is that right? And what's that do to your business model?
No, well, I mean, I think the flip side is that the way I kind of view it is today in the 3G world, if we were all kind of operating out of like a studio and trying to live in a dorm room kind of thing, now with 4G LTE for us, we've kind of upgraded to a 40-bedroom mansion. So there's actually, going from a 1-lane highway to a 10-lane highway. So there's like a whole lot more lanes. And so from that perspective, there's actually plenty of room, and we've designed it that way. So, you know, when I read some of the answers there, the way I look at it is that's also why we're focused on kind of making sure that the devices can actually handle all this extra complexity, because as we add in new capabilities, we're not taking anything out. Like our 3G network isn't going down, our 2G network isn't going down, we're just adding more in, and so we're actually hitting upon limits inside the device. Like, hey, what about going from quad band to octo band, right? Because today we can't handle 8 bands, and we need to. If you want to do world LTE, you don't want to be packing another phone to go to Europe and pack another phone to go to Asia. You want to have one device that will work with all of them. And in a world where we heard earlier battery life, if in this new scenario where you want to utilize all this bandwidth, your battery runs out at 11 a.m., it doesn't matter that the device could do all this stuff because you wouldn't have had the juice to actually kind of sustain it. So there's a lot of things that we've been working on to solve for that. So, on the backhaul, fiber is our common ingredient. So we just kind of line fiber wherever we need, and that's got tons of capacity. So right now, I think we're not really worried about capacity, and so from this perspective, it's more about like delivering what people actually need and value are willing to pay for. And I think...
Is there a chance you're going to be able to obviate all this heterogeneity and going off different networks, and I'll just have one network that actually works everywhere with the bandwidth I need? Any hope of that?
Yeah, no, and we, just at Mobile World Congress, we announced VoLTE. So for us, voice over LTE allows for the voice over, the voice traffic to occur on that pipe. So we will, be able to kind of allow for more things to run on that. And so for us to kind of consolidate around one, we've got a clear plan around how we operate this and do it reliably. So. Okay.
Well, so I apologize. I know the audience probably has a lot of questions. We're kind of experimenting with this panel format. We gave it an hour. In our 5 minutes that are left, what I'd actually like to do is the panelists to wrap up and basically address a couple things. Number one, are there any disruptive technologies that you hear about that's going to change this whole thing and it's going to obviate some of the questions that I've been asking, number one? Or number two, is there anything else you want to tell us today that you didn't get a chance? So I'll start at the far end again.
I guess I would just say it's hard to have a platform. It's at least $100 million a year investment. Linux is an open platform, but it's not successful as a phone platform because it doesn't have this investment in a controlled way. It doesn't have the development environment tools that you see with iOS and Microsoft 7 and Android. The development environment is a factor for these apps, and that's a hefty investment, not to mention all investment in the drivers and things like that you need to support all the new features that all your partners are going to generate. And so it's some tricky combination. You need to be open enough to get leverage, but you need to be close enough so you have control of the environment, you can leverage new features, you can get things implemented quickly. And that's a tricky balance, and that's certainly, I think, you'll see versions of that story, including the Nokia-Microsoft deal, which is, in my mind, what that's about. It makes sense to move to a platform that has good development tools and the ability to deliver software on that scale, compared to what essentially was Symbian or Linux before, which didn't have the same kind of support systems. But I think that story will play out a few different ways.
I'm not sure about disruptive things that will solve the problems. I think there are some interesting disruptive things that make our problems worse, which might be more interesting. Video, for example, over mobile networks, I'm a big believer in. We start seeing this a lot with handsets, but as you start getting more and more tablets, high-def video over 3 and 4G networks. If you thought the load from existing phones was bad, you should try it with that on. I think there's some interesting elements with those new types of traffic. Already we see in some countries people like Netflix and BBC iPlayer accounting for massive slices of broadband traffic. I think one thing we didn't touch upon was mobile health. e-health, those kind of scenarios, using phones in non-traditional scenarios like at-home care, diabetes care, those kind of scenarios, which are, I think, interesting and take mobile in a different direction, actually, through different potential service providers. You know, the Keizers of the world will be wanting to provide some service. So, a couple of trends.
Let's see, there are kind of two parts to that. So on the disruptive side, I really see some of the stuff I think I tried to spoke about before, which has to do with the local video and audio processing and things allowing really new user interfaces. As far as general thoughts, I was thinking, when we've been talking so far, I just kind of realized that, and a little bit comes off the mHealth, and I was thinking about it also, we've been having a discussion that's a little bit kind of the developed world way this is going to evolve. And by that I say, you know, we're looking at the developed world, you know, we've got some people providing hardware, we've got some people providing personalized devices, so I think there's more room for value because we consider these very personalized versus my PC. I don't seem to have as much things, so I want it more different, and everybody's different. And then the ecosystem people who can provide monetization and a more ecosystem in getting it. When we go to the developed world, what I'd say is different is, I actually think there the carriers may play a much larger role in that. You go to a lot of the, so the App Store for Apple really works when you get a credit card. You look in a lot of the developing world, and there are way more cell phones than people have bank accounts. Forget credit cards, they don't even have bank accounts. They just have a cell phone. So I think that puts potentially in the developing world a very different scenario evolving where the carrier may play a much more central role because they're one of the few people who has a monetization relationship with the end users, and eventually, like Eric brought up, these things are expensive to maintain. Somebody wants to be monetizing this, and I really think a lot of our conversation so far has been a developed world conversation. I think the developing world could evolve fairly differently because of these economic factors.
So for us, I mean, it's easy for us to kind of focus on us as the early adopters, but you know, our installed base, the middle and late adopters are still using regular phones. And so that's the majority of our whole population. And so from that perspective, kind of the disruptive element is how do we get them on board to leverage these smartphones and superphones? They're not going to just get it because someone's telling them they should. They're going to actually need it. So more thinking is going to be required to kind of figure out how to actually bring those people to deliver or have the utility and to justify actually having those devices. And so the reality there is that we're looking to kind of, you know, we have a lot of momentum and growth in the superphone and the smartphone category, but you know, we don't want to force a solution on someone that doesn't actually need it and value it. So I think there's still that whole area, and I think the health and wellness actually is a big area as America and the population continues to get older and older. That's an underserved category, and everyone can't, you know, justify having all the costs of nursing home and live-in, you know, help to kind of monitor the drug compliance. You know, so much money is spent in that category, which can actually be prevented. But then also, I mean, I heard a statistic somewhere where if patients actually had the drugs that the doctors prescribed to them, the market would double, right? And so that means it's like one of those things where things are already being prescribed, they're just not actually being complied. So I think the thing I'll just kind of top it off with is, you know, we spent $12 billion to build the 4G network, and from that perspective, you know, we never designed it to just simulate and be a faster 3G network. So the idea here clearly, and this is kind of the open call to the Valley here, and also now to academia, is, you know, how can we best leverage this together? And so my team is focused on making that stuff happen because we don't have to have all the insights around finding what that new killer app or that new killer use case is. We've designed ourselves to be able to adapt to things when they do come on knocking on our door, that we know how to commercialize them, right? Because it's one thing to kind of incubate, but if we don't incubate and if we don't realize it, it doesn't matter that we incubated it, right? So view us as that playground for the future, because we do want to make it happen and have it be relevant.
So, and give me an example of a 4G app that couldn't be a 3G app.
So, you know, I guess in the stock market, you know, that's clearly on the extreme, right, where the millisecond delays ends up being the difference of winning or losing. That's very high-end extreme. But, you know, if you're also kind of at that point doing remote invasive surgery, you can't have lags and stutters, and so video ends up being kind of the most obvious. And we don't, not just because you can use video doesn't mean everyone wants to see everyone all the time, right? There's certain high value interactions that actually need it. But I think that's part of the opportunity here, is to kind of figure out, hey, what is needed? Because there's obvious things, but then they're not necessarily relevant to everybody. And I think that's kind of where we want to kind of stretch our brains into the different verticals, into the different areas, because we don't try to pretend to have all the answers.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. So I'd like to thank the audience for your attention. Again, I know a lot of you are bursting with questions and just didn't figure out how to roll that in the format that we have today. I'd like to thank these panelists again. Humphrey came all the way from Barcelona back early. He'll take a red eye back to the East Coast.
I don't know what time zone I'm in.
Yeah, Greg's a busy guy.